resource person. She is currently Dean of University School of Mass Communication, Indraprastha University, New Delhi, and senior most faculty member of Law Department of the same university. Ma'am has 20 years of teaching experience. She completed her PhD in Empire in the Hills, a study of Shimla, Darjeeling, Uttarakhand, and Mount Abu late 19th and early 20th century. Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Ma'am has also awarded Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Scholarship for Doctoral Studies in India given by Nehru Memorial Fund in 1997 to 1999. She was postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla. Ma'am has also selected for an ICCR India Chair of Indian Studies abroad, the University of Vienna, Austria, to teach for one semester. Ma'am is currently appointed as chairperson of various committees and members of numerous academic bodies. She also organized many conferences, seminars, workshops, etc. in her academic competency. Apart from participating and presenting papers in various seminars and conferences, she has also authored many books and numerous publications in reputed national and international journals to her credit. Welcome, ma'am, and enlighten us with your valuable and thought-provoking lecture.
Thank
Ma'am,
you so
over to
much.
you.
Thank you so much for your generous introduction. Um, I begin by thanking the Integral University, Dr. Naseem Ahmed Jafri, the head of the Department of Law there, and Dr. Mirza Junaid Beg for getting in touch with me and inviting me for this lecture. I thank you for this opportunity to share my views with all of you. My area of specialization happens to be the mountain spaces of India, the hills of India, and also the indigenous people, the point of view, the perspectives of the indigenous people. So, with these few words, I would like to begin my presentation, and please feel free at the end of the presentation to have a discussion or questions or your views on it. Some of the readings which are relevant for us with what I'm going to discuss here. These are the readings. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am. You are
These,
audible.
thank you. These are the readings which have been very useful in developing many of the insights which I am sharing with you today. Many of these are related to the works to colonial ecology, the environment, and the kind of changes which come in modern times with the process of colonization. So that is why, for me, a historical perspective to what is the position of the indigenous people today becomes very relevant. Many a times we talk about the rights of the indigenous people in today's context with various conventions, laws, both national and international, but there are sometimes questions that what happened to them that this kind of a requirement is there for the indigenous people. So, and what are the challenges of the indigenous people in today's time? Because the general impression of the indigenous people is people who were there since the times immemorial, some of them who have been considered to be the original inhabitants, the autochthons of the place, some of those who have for centuries together continuously resided in one place, and they have common community associations. So these are the kind of concerns which are there. And the questions that emerge basically are what we need to address today. But the understanding of the past here becomes very important for us. So, the focus of today's presentation, as I'm mentioning in the introduction, is with regard to the kind of intersection which is there between human rights, sustainable development, and the indigenous people in today's context. For that, we need to understand the role of colonialism, which started, and especially modern colonialism. It isn't that colonization was not happening since times immemorial. But colonization was happening right from ancient times. But it is the modern colonization which actually brings about such large-scale disruptions in the traditional societies, their way of life, customary practices, that today these concerns have to be addressed by international forum as well as the nation states. So these are the challenges that we are looking for. And what happened, the entire process of colonization, which began in 16th century in Europe and which spread first to America and then to other parts of Asia and Africa, this process has to be understood because it is leading to dispossession and displacement of a large section of indigenous population. We know about the Caribbean, we know about the America, and how there is a violent displacement, even destruction of the resources and even people of the continent. So this is a kind of an irreversible trend, one can say, with the process of colonization that takes place in the modern context, beginning with the Spaniards and the Portuguese who sent their explorers to different parts of the world, and then, of course, moving on to the 18th century colonization, which was in India, and the 19th century in Africa, which led to the marginalization and dispossession of the people. So, due to all these factors, the concerns of the indigenous people are common across countries in contemporary times, and that is why some of them are taken together. With these few words, a very brief outline of how I'm looking at it. One, what I explained to you, how colonization is taking place first in America and then in Indian context, and finally the contemporary position. So this is how broadly I have divided my presentation. First, touching upon briefly the process of colonization in America, then moving on to India in particular, though the entire Asia is involved. And we know Edward Said's work on West Asia, which has been very important for us to understand Orientalism and the process of colonization of the Eastern societies and the Orient, as it was called. So the Eastern world by the West was called Orient. And there is a process, what we call the process of otherization, which has been explained by Edward Said and many others, how the West is looking at the East in terms of a process of otherization. And that process of otherization in many ways is a process in which people are being stereotyped, they are being typecast, and a certain kind of categorization of people is being done as if they are under a microscopic lens, and they are being looked up as species, a kind of a scientific lens under which people are being put just like other species, animals and plants. So this is a kind of a scrutiny under which the people are put in these different parts of the world which were colonized by the Western world. So this is a kind of situations that we're going to look at. So first I begin with the process of colonialism, the case of America. As we all know that and sometimes the question comes why it is the Europe which is going ahead of the rest of the world. Some of the answers are related to the process of Renaissance, which begins in Europe somewhere in the 14th century, where they start questioning a lot of the practices of the church, and there is a revival of classical Greek and Roman literature and style of architecture, culture, etc. So due to this, there is a certain degree of questioning, and it leads to a lot of scientific discoveries. And in the process, they decide to venture out in the world to explore the world beyond Europe. So it is in this context that they move towards different parts of the world, and they move into the first of the places that they move into is America, especially the Spaniards, and it leads to massive destruction and displacement of the indigenous people, what were called the Mesoamericans and the Red Indians. Their entire lifestyles were destroyed. The process of colonization and dehumanization of the indigenous population and their changing demographies is graphically recorded by Todorov, William Cronon, among others. There are many who have written extensively on these, and I would like to quote here Todorov when he talks about the process of colonization, and it will give you an idea about how brutal was this process of colonization of America. Um and this is what Todorov writes in The Conquest of America, highlighting the tragic onslaught on Indians, which has no parallels, past or present. The conquest by Cortes, who was one of the conquistadors, is an eye opener. On the eve of the conquest, Mexico's population was about 25 million in 600. In 1600, 25 million. In 1600, it was reduced to 1 million. This is the extent to which they have destroyed their lives there. And I would like to quote here, it constitutes a record not only in relative terms, destruction of the order of 90% or more, but also in absolute terms. Since we are speaking of a population diminution, and this is of all that is happening in America, estimated at 70 million human lives. None of the great massacres of the 20th century can be compared to this hecatomb. This is Todorov talking. And there are instances of what they do with the indigenous population. One governor in the Spanish area sold 10,000 Indians as slaves out of a population of 25,000. The Indians abandoned their villages. The inhuman treatment of the slaves is apparent from the fact that many Indians stopped procreation in order to prevent slavery for their children. The condition of the slave labor in the mines was heart wrenching. Couples were separated and could only mate once every 8 or 10 months. Mothers were overworked and exhausted and had no milk for the newborns. Within 3 months of the conquest of Cuba, around 7,000 children died there alone. So I'm reading out these excerpts to give you an idea how they were they were dehumanized. They lost their self respect, they lost the dignity, they lost their land, they lost their identity, and it happened in a brutal manner. And it is just not the massacre. The working in the mines is also causing large scale deaths. And if something else remained, the diseases like smallpox. These people did not have, they were not vaccinated or inoculated against smallpox. So the Europeans brought with them diseases which the Indians had no protection against, and many of them lost their lives to diseases which were brought to America from Europe. So these are the kind of challenges and the kind of tragedies which one finds. The one of the most horrifying episode was the massacre at Caunau in Cuba, perpetrated by Navarrese troops. The Spaniards wanted to test their newly sharpened swords. The soldiers drew out their swords and began to rip open the bellies to cut and kill men, women, and children, and the elderly. They entered the houses brutally, killing and stabbing as many Indians as they could find, and I quote, so that a stream of blood was running as if a great number of cows had perished. In 1570, Alonso de Zorita wrote, and I quote, I had known a judge to say publicly from his dais, speaking in a loud voice, that if water were lacking to irrigate the Spaniard farms, they could be watered with the blood of Indians. Close quote. So these are these. I hope this I have been able to place the perspective why the concerns of indigenous in today's time and their human rights and their way of life is very important, because sustainable development, when we talk about sustainable development, it is a kind of a symbiotic relationship between the people and their environment, their habitat, the habitat that they live in. And in the pre-colonial times, pre-modern times, there was a kind of a balance between the natural surrounding and the people. But with the coming of the modern societies, the modern colonial state, with its process of commercialization and subsequently industrialization, that natural balance between the human beings and the society, the habitat was disrupted. And that is what we need to understand, why the habitat is disrupting. And in the garb of development, in the garb of progress, this was what the colonial state ideologically postured, that this is for the sake of development, and the indigenous populations are basically backward, they are ignorant, and they need to be modernized. So these are the kind of arguments which the colonial state gives. So with this, I move on to the colonization in India, which the story of colonization. I hope, Junaid, I'm not going very fast. It's okay.
Ma'am, it's okay. No problem.
Yeah, no, because in case it doesn't make sense, please do let me know. So in the story of colonization in India begins sometime in 18th century. We know that there was a period after the 1707, the decline of the great Mughals, and then the period of regional powers flourishing in this period, and the coming of the English East India Company with the Battle of Plassey and then the Battle of Buxar. So these developments are taking place. But simultaneous to the movement of the East India Company to different parts of India, there is also uprisings against the East India Company, and the tribal uprisings are also happening at the same time in India. To mention some of the well-known and well-known ones, the Bhil uprising, which started in 1818, 1831, the Coal uprising in 1831-32, Santhal rebellion, 1855-56, and the Munda uprising. It is linked with the movement of the East India Company. As they are moving to different parts of India, there is a resistance which is offered by the Indian people and also the indigenous people in particular. My area of research is primarily the hills, the mountain spaces, as I mentioned in the beginning. So I would be looking at the process of colonization in the hills. And that is something which is taking place in the 19th century. And the areas which I have primarily focused is on Shimla, Darjeeling, Uttarakhand, and Mount Abu. And we see the kind of tensions which come in with the coming of the British, advent of the British in these hill spaces. And the British are moving in these spaces for the reasons of their own. Some of it was related to the fact that they came from the cold temperate countries and they were looking for similar environment in India, and the mountains provided that kind of a cool temperate environment that they were looking for. In fact, I would like to, they felt that this is one place where they felt closest to the people, and I would just like to read out, which will give you an idea. That's which Gerard and Lloyd, when they first go to Shimla, they were among the early travelers to go to Shimla, and this is what they say, and I quote: "This day's journey I shall always remember, for it reminded me of home, the days of my boyhood, my mother, and the happiest of varied recollection. I recognized a great number of trees and flowers common there, such as the fir, the oak, the apricot, the pear, the cherry, together with wild roses, raspberries, strawberries, thistle dandelions, nettles, daisies, and many others. There was, too, an indescribable something in the breeze which brought back a comparative similarity of feeling. So, for many of them, it was home away from home, a mini England in the tropics. Many of these mountain places were seen as mini Englands, and they felt that there is an affinity to their country from where they have come to these places. But what is important is in this imagination, where they're talking about the vegetation, which is a Western vegetation, where is the Indian presence? And that is important, as if there are no Indians there. The way they are describing and representing the mountain spaces, the colonizers, that is, they are simply ignoring the presence of the Indians in the mountains, especially the local populations residing in the mountains, which had had interaction over centuries, and a lot of different communities settled in the mountains. But there is no mention of those. And that is interesting, because colonization is just not happening at the level of violent displacement of people. Colonization is also happening when the past of this particular region, that is the hills, is being erased. The history of the hills is being erased. The history of the people of these places is being erased. There is no mention of the people. There is a mention of the land of the hills, but there is no mention of the people of the hills. So, this is a kind of a subtle erasure of the histories of these hill spaces, where what we know, and many of us are familiar, is the hill stations which were developed by the British. We know that British in their colonization in India developed more than 200 hill stations. Shimla, Darjeeling, Uti, Mount Abu have been among the well-known hill stations. Murray in Pakistan. So we do know that. These hill spaces were developed. So the general impression in the minds of the people is, oh, these are British creations, they were developed by the British. So the history begins with the coming of the hill stations. But no, history is not beginning with the coming of the hill stations. There is already a history there of the place, which is completely erased. And that in itself is the biggest violence, a kind of an epistemological violence, which is done on the indigenous people of the hills. Their knowledge, their tradition, that is simply either overlooked, ignored, or just dismissed. So one has to look at these various levels when today we are planning for policies and laws and regulations for the indigenous people. We need to understand that what all level the erasures are taking place. And this is happening to all the weaker, vulnerable sections, the minorities, the indigenous people, the SCs, STs. This is a different level it is happening. We'll come to what is happening now. So the British actually were removing these kinds of any kind of footprints of the past in many ways, or imprints of the past, because they wanted to legitimize their colonization by saying that these are empty spaces. We did not displace anyone. We simply came, found these empty places in the mountains, and we decide to develop them. This is how the logic of colonization is working, legitimize themselves either by saying that these are empty lands, or these are lands devoid of people. And if there are places where they do acknowledge people, then they say, oh, these are people who have been not civilized, they are barbaric. That is the argument they give, that they are outdated, they are backward, they're ignorant. So they are outdated. So this is a kind of a process which is taking place, which one needs to understand when we come to this. So the process of colonization actually pushes the indigenous people to the periphery, ignoring or erasing their histories. And in the what is this happening in the process? The indigenous people were being typecast. There were stereotypical categories in which they were put, and which was a very powerful hegemonic device of the colonial state and of the very modern states also, that how they are categorizing people. So the first category that they are posturing is a place without history. Another thing they're saying, oh, the people who live there are the relics of the past. They are fossilized. They have never developed themselves. They have not evolved in terms of the civilizational scale. They are primitive. They are barbaric. So this is a kind of a thing that they are talking about. Even because they are barbaric, because they are backward, they have not developed the landscape. So the landscape still remains the same. This is an argument which goes against sustainable development, because for them the fact that these indigenous people may be living in harmony with their surroundings, with their natural habitat, is something which does not suit the colonial enterprise. They want these people to be actually rather they're looking at this kind of landscape is something to be developed and exploited commercially. That was so important for them. So for them, landscape escape, the word they're using is inert, passive. These are very negative, pejorative terms which are being used by them. Then eternal and timeless, that these are the people and the land which is eternal, which is timeless. Now, what is eternal and timeless? That's something which is ahistorical, which is anti-history, because these people have never moved in time. They're just stuck in time of the past. Once again, they have been slaughtered. Then backward and primitive. They are not. They are just not high on the civilizational scale. They are lower in the evolutionary scale. These are some of the stereotypes which have come, and I would like to mention a few. This is what they say: under the shadow of advancing civilization, there can, we fear, be little question that this lectures, interesting and attractive race, lectures are in Darjeeling and Sikkim, interesting, attractive race will soon go the way of the forest, which they believe to be their original home. Now, this is very interesting. This is one of the sources, these are primary sources of history, the Gazetteer of Sikkim, and it is written by an English colonial officer, H. Risley, and which they believe that just as the forests are gradually diminishing, are going away in the mountain places, similarly, these forest people, the Lepchas, will also disappear because they cannot withstand the modernization and the advancement of civilization. But who is introducing these changes, developmental changes in the hills? It is these very colonizers, for their commercial interests, for trading purposes, for plantation, the tea plantations which come up in Darjeeling, for their offices, houses, settlements which are coming up in the hills. That lot of forest is being cut down, and there is a process of deforestation which begins from the period of colonization, the modern colonization in India. These are aspects that they are not, they are simply ignoring in the name of progress and advancement of civilization. So these are very strategic terms. This is the hegemonic device that they are using, and accusing the lepchas for not changing with the changing times, because these are the lepchas who would not like to associate with the more process of modernization. So this is an accusation which is coming up. Then there is another representation of these indigenous people. Here are the people who have not yet forgotten beauty in the everyday things of daily life. It is inherited by them from an ancient civilization which changes little and which they preserve through custom. This hill country, which has changed so little through the long centuries, echoes the truth of the words of Guglielmo Ferrero. We admire Asia for the same reason which impels Americans to visit Europe, because we need to find again, to admire, to save the remains of the ancient civilization. Now, this is again something which is talking about a static East, a static Orient. And this also justifies the European colonization of the East because of the very static nature, that these people have remained unchanging. And that is what they're talking about here. And this is a kind of a very paternalistic perspective which also comes out in the colonial records about these indigenous people, that it is the colonizers who know what is best for these people because they themselves are children. So it is this quotation I'm reading: in these hills of India you may still find that lost paradise and regain some of the enchantment of that ancient yet ever young world, where the people are children and where you feel that fours and elves and even a satyr or two may be round the next corner. Here the gods of nature still reign and are worshipped. So look at the two aspects which are emerging. One, how the indigenous people in the hills are closely connected to nature. We do know about the Lepchas, that they were called as the woodmen of the woods, who knew every herb, every plant which was there in their habitat. So this was a kind of a close connection which was there between the natural surrounding and the people of the hills, and which would be eventually disrupted in the name of advancing civilization, in the name of progress, in the name of development. So that actually gives you an idea how the indigenous people and their environment is being disrupted for the purposes of a colonial state. The colonial enterprise, as we know, is a capitalist enterprise. It's a commercial enterprise. First, when they come to India, it is for commerce. And from there, eventually, with the process of industrialization advancing in England, they also need raw material, the resources. And when the trains, railways are coming into India, they need large supply of timber for the seats, the wooden seats and all that will come in. So there is a huge requirement of the forest wealth of India, and that is when they start also introducing the forest regulations and laws with regard to the mountains. So that will have its own implications. So when we talk about sustainable development, these aspects are some things which we need to keep in mind. And in all this, there is no consent of the indigenous people. Whatever developments are taking place at the level of the colonial state. The indigenous people are not even asked about their interests. They are simply being patronized under the paternalism of the colonial state. That, oh, the colonial state knows what is best for the indigenous people. So that's a kind of paternalism we are talking about. So this is something which in Europe was also with in sync or synchronized with the progressive Whiggish view, which was an evolutionary paradigm. That is from the historical perspective, which is seen in an evolutionary teleology, that from ancient primitive people became civilized, and the people became advanced, and then finally the most civilized. So Asia was the oldest, Europe was ahead of Asia, and America was further ahead on the evolutionary scale. So this is a kind of argument which justifies the taking over by the advanced civilizations of the lesser advanced civilizations. These are the kind of arguments. If you even see international law of that time, they talk about the similar things, that only the civilized nations of the world would be part of international law paradigm. So these are the kind of arguments which are emerging at that time in Europe, and they are looking at everything in an evolutionary paradigm. These are some of the one of the pictures. Here you have a picture of a Toda couple, and if you can see below in the picture, they have written Adam and Eve. So they are talking here. It's very interesting that they are putting them into a Christian iconography, and they are also being shown as part of a kind of past which is no longer where the Europe has moved, but somewhere in India are these group of indigenous communities which are still stuck in a kind of a time warp. They are still stuck in a kind of a timelessness, in an eternal time. So this is a kind of thing which is also represented at that time in the ethnographic studies which come up of that period of the Todas in Nilgiris and Uttarakhand. Along with the colonized perspective, there is another perception of the mountains and how mountains are appropriated and imagined, and which is a Brahminic perception. I'm not going into great detail about it, but there is a kind of a convergence in because the hills were also places where if you see the Brahminic perspective, there you have as places of pilgrimage. It is the place where the place of abode of Mahadev or Shiv, and it is also it has a kind of a Brahminic landscape where rishis and sages and seers, they move in the quest of spirituality and different kind of things that they talk about. Now it is very interesting because somewhere the Brahminic and the British perspective converge, because for both of them the hill spaces are pure spaces. Pure spaces are empty spaces. Spaces empty of people. But there are people. There are indigenous population. Gradually, the other people also come in, like the Brahmins, the Rajputs, the Peers, and there are local cultivating communities along with the nomadic communities. They all come and settle in these places over a period of time, and but they see these as the empty spaces. So what is happening in the process, when both the Brahminic perspective and the colonial perspective is looking at the mountain spaces as empty spaces, once again they are taking away the history of the local people, the indigenous population. They are not looking at the views of the local people. What are their traditions, their customs, their practices, their way of life, their worldview? So the question for a historian is there a worldview of the local people? Is there a way of life of the local people? That is something. Do they have rules and regulations? Of course they have, because this is how the societies have been operating. But we have completely ignored in a very dominant mainstream view, where the views of the people on the periphery have not been considered. So when we look at this past, we are also looking at the point of view of the local people. What are these indigenous communities? How are these indigenous communities looking at the landscape, or their place where they stay? It is their place. And what comes out from my research also, and many others, that it is a lived space for these people. It is not a spiritual space which is away from the human settlement. It is also a lived space. It is also a sacred space, because we know that the temporal and the sacred in the traditional societies coexist together. There, it is not a separation of the temporal and the sacred. And these particular places are artifactual maps of memory. What is this artifactual maps of memory? The actions of the ancestors of the past, which are there in their oral tradition. The written tradition has erased many uh, of the or superimposed upon the oral tradition, but there is a lively oral tradition in terms of their stories, in mythologies, folk tales, which one comes across. So this is a kind of a challenge for a historian also, which had in the past been dependent a lot on written tradition. But now we are also looking at the possibility of a different imagination of the place, a different way of looking at the place. And why I'm laying emphasis on this is because this is what is important for understanding the entire process of sustainable development, that you cannot substitute one with other. When you look at the habitat, you have to look at the habitat as a whole, which includes people and the others, flora, fauna, vegetation, other kinds of things which are there, the different species, the diversity of the local habitat also has to be kept in mind. So when we look at the indigenous view, we find that these mountains were lively spaces. There were various gods, goddesses, celestial nature spirits, because many of these people in the indigenous people, like the Todas, the Bhils, the Lepchas, the Girasias, Badagas, the Gaddis, they were nature worshippers. Most of them were nature worshippers. They was they had semi-animistic beliefs, and for them, every nook and corner of the place, rivers, woods, and sholas were the embodiment of heavenly ancestral spirits of good and evil forces. Sholas are there in Nilgiris, and these was a shrub which is what gave the blue haze to the Nilgiris, because of which it was termed as the Nilgiris. And I'll come to it, that how with the colonization, this unique vegetation, the sholas of the Nilgiris, are also affected. In 1848, Hooker, he's a very well-known English botanist who visited India at that time. Hooker's journal, Himalayan Journal, in 1848, Joseph Dalton Hooker wrote about the Lepchas. To the good they paid no heed. Why should we, they say? The good spirits do us no harm. The evil spirits who dwell in every rock, grove, and mountain are constantly at mischief, and to them we must pray, for they hurt us. So this is a kind of a belief which actually believes in the nurturing and conservation. Similarly, in Shimla, we find that there is a place called Churel Ki Baoli very close to Shimla. And basically, it was the local way. Ramchandra Gua has referred in his book Unquiet Woods about how the the people in the mountains were natural conservationists and preservationists. They preserved it by weaving stories around their groves, to protect their groves, to protect their wells, which were the natural reservoir of water. So this, by weaving this kind of a story about Churel Ki Baoli, this very important water reservoir was actually protected. It was conserved. So these are things in which they were actually, the hill people or the indigenous population was natural conservators. That is what is important to keep in mind. It was also a lived landscape for them, because there was an intimate relationship with the land, which is revealed in their mythologies. The landscape is represented in myth and represents the myth. There is an intensely personal and biographical relationship between people, the land, and their ancestral beings. According to the hill people, the ancestors created the world and interacted with it, and such perceptions established continuity with the past. So, when we talk today in the rights of the indigenous people, we do talk about the community traditions, the collective rights and land usage with these, actually associate them not just with, because associate them not just with their past, but it is also equally important that for them it was not, land was not commerce, land was not economics, land was a sentimental bond. William Cronin has mentioned about it, that for them land is a sentimental connection. It is a land of their ancestors, where their ancestors played out their everyday activities, and hence it's a land of memories for them. It is not transactional the way we understand in modern times. It's not a commodity, it's not a transaction which is there for them. So, any alienation and deprivation of land from its rightful owners and heirs was seen as a violation and desecration of their land. And we have many mythological stories, folk tales, which shows that when the British were taking over their land, there is a resentment, there is a sense of resistance. It may not overtly spill out in terms of actual battle or pitched fight, but yes, that resentment comes out in their stories. And we will see these stories in case of Darjeeling, in case of Wheels, in Mount Abu. So these people, so when they say there is no resistance to the British coming into the mountains, actually that is not the case. People are showing their resentment to that kind of overtaking of their land. That is something which they are talking about. And for them, land is very personal. It is not transactional. So this becomes very important. So when we look at the history of the place before the coming of the colonizers, what do we find? We find pre colonial settlements. We find a pastoral landscape. We also find an agrarian landscape, which is, of course, a shifting agriculture, a very simple agricultural lifestyle, a landscape of hunting, a trading landscape, because there used to be trading entrepôts, certain sites in which people from plains and hills will come and exchange their commodities, people from different places. I will show you the photograph of CP Fair, where also the people will come in the fair and exchange their local goods and commodities in the barter economy. So it was a kind of a barter system which existed. There were festivities and customs, which is part of any pre-modern traditional society. So it's a very lively landscape which one come across at that time. This is the CP Fair. It is one of the, it's a village fair in Shimla. It is one of the oldest fairs of Shimla, which has been there for a long time. And the British, when they came to Shimla, they patronized this fair. And there used to be a lot of festivities, and the local Raja would be presiding over the fair. So these kinds of things were already in existence. I'm sorry, kindly excuse me for the quality of the picture. It's not a very good one, but that's an old picture. Then another aspect, because when the British say that there is no people with whom to enter into a lease or enter into treaties, it isn't like that. Of course, they do enter into, interestingly, they do enter into treaties with the local chiefs of the place for taking this place. But the argument is that this land was not, it did not belong to anyone. There was no population, there were no people. But when we look at these places, they have their names. We have wondered at times how Shimla called Shimla. It is not given by the British. It has a local semiotics. It has a local tradition which is embedded into it. So they have their own origin stories. So certainly, because they are living in harmony with nature, so to the colonizers it seems as if these are underdeveloped land because there are no the movement of the people. But they are very much replete with people. There are people residing, but they're residing in harmony with the natural habitat because they were of the forest. So they knew the ways of the forest and they knew how to use the resources of the forest. They had a lot of knowledge about healing herbs. They had knowledge about hunting. They had knowledge about things, how to do various, use the various resources of the forests. So these are kind of things which we completely overlook. For instance, very briefly, I'll give you Shimla. How is it Shimla called Shimla? It's actually Shamali. They say there was a temple of goddess Shamala Devi, who was probably an indigenous goddess, and it was there that the fakir would offer waters to the travelers who would be going. And this is how the Shimla was actually based on Shamali. And then under the British, they made it sound easy. They gave it an easier sounding pronunciation of Simla or Shimla. So this is how this particular name developed. Same is the case with Darjeeling. Darjeeling most likely was Dojiling or Dojiliang, which had its meaning in the Tibetan language as well as the local language of the Lepchas, who called themselves to be the children of the wrong. So this was mystic thunderbolt of the Lamaist religion. Now in Darjeeling, interestingly, we also find that there was a Lamaist monastery or Gompa on the highest point of the hill, which was called by the British later as Observatory Hill. Now, this is very interesting. It is the most elevated point of Darjeeling, and it has a vantage position because from that point you can look at the entire space in the vicinity. And that space was given to their deity. The monastery was constructed. Now, the British, when they came to this place, they also found it ideal for surveillance, for looking at the entire station, and also to symbolize the presence of the British among the people. So, what do they do? For them, this space, which was a Lamaist space, was actually a problematic. They go about effacing and marginalizing that space to prevent it from becoming the source of a rival symbolism. They did not want it to become a space of symbolism because their narrative was, the colonial narrative was, that they were unchallenged, they were uncontested. These were empty landscape. There were no people there, but there are people. So they will come up with a counter argument. See, they do not just confine to one. The counter argument they come up is that, oh, these people may have been living at one point of time, the lectures, but they abandoned this place. So they have not actually done anything wrong by taking the place. So these are the kind of arguments they will come up. So that happens in almost in every place that they move. Utakaman. Utakaman again was very difficult to pronounce for the English, so they call Urekaman, so they called it Uti or Utakaman, and it actually is coming from the word Mand, which is a village in the Toda language. So they of course shortened it to Uti, and this is how the name was actually derived from the Toda language, and this is the Toda Mand. This particular place that you see in the middle, and which was built from the local resources, the local bamboo and the local wood and timber which was available. And some of these mands were Tiriyaris, which are the place of their religious prayers and worship. And so see how the close connection between the nature, and in the middle of these thick, dense vegetation, we find this beehive shaped Toda hut or mand. And there are a few Toda men sitting in front of it. So this was a typical traditional Toda hunt, which was there at the time. Then now Abu is interesting because Abu was also mentioned in many Vedic texts, especially in the Rig Vedas and others. We come across the story of Abu. So Abu had been, and this is associated with Arbudha, the goddess Arbudha's temple is there in Abu, and the story is told by the local balladeers, Bhats, who sing the story of origin. And this is one of the story that they describe of. This is what they say: Gunwant Vasad Gare Gaye, Mehman Padi Brahmkhand Mai, Aushadan Dood Bhutang Apar, Balwan Dhenu Nisariyo Bar. So there is a miraculous cow, and it fell into the hollow chasm. And if you look at it scientifically, probably there was a meteor, and it created a hollow, and out of this, the famous Nakki Lake came up. And they, of course, in the Brahminical mythologies, it became the nail of Indra, which led to the creation of the lake, etc. So there are many stories about it, but what is important, it's a very dynamic relationship they are imagining between the earth, the mountain, and the netherworld. Because the story that goes about Arbuda is that when this chasm, this hollow was created, the rishi goes to the Him Parvat and requests him to come and fill up the chasm. So the rishi, the Him Parvat, says that he can't move and come. So he asks the his son to go and fill up the chasm. The son says, "I'm lame." So who would take him to the fill up the hollow space in mountain? So they request this serpent called Arbuda to take him to the place. So when the serpent takes, he has two conditions: that he must have the place must be named after him, and that it should have vegetation and Mahadev's temple, etc. So these are the kind of stories which one come across. So there is a kind of, the netherworld is represented by snake, earth is of course the cow, and mountain is of course the mount there. So these are the kind of dynamic interaction which one sees in the traditional imagination of the hill people. Most likely it's an indigenous perspective, which is what was taken into Brahminical perspective. Then we come to the question that when the colonization is taking place, there is a story of resistance. What is that resistance? The colonists would like to believe that all these people were either they were not there, or if they were there, they were always colonized. For instance, in Darjeeling, lepchas were always colonized, first by the Tibetans, then by the Nepalese, and then by the Bhutias, etc. So there is always a narrative. So they justify their taking over, that the British also come, and rather they come as saviors of the lepchas. In the beginning, this is what they project. But when they realize that the lepchas are not cooperating with them in process of modernization, in the cultivation of the tea plantation, or other activities of urban settlement, they of course start promoting the Nepalese at the expense of the lepcha. So one sees in Darjeeling a demographic change. More Nepalese start coming into and settling down into Darjeeling. So one sees there is a tale of resentment which one finds. There is Observatory, as I mentioned to you earlier. Observatory Hill was the place of worship of the lepchas, where they offered their prayers to their main god Kinchin, which is Kanchenjunga, the famous mountain range. According to the local lepcha tradition narrated by Sarkimit Lepcha, she was an 80-year-old lepcha lady. The British attacked and occupied Observatory Hill by using gunpowder. In the process, the lepcha shrine of god Kinchin was despoiled and desanctified. The lepchas believed that Lord Kinchin showed his wrath by devastating large parts of Darjeeling in a subsequent landslide. So this is their kind of, they are looking at a divine retribution which is coming, and the destruction of Darjeeling Hills at that time. Similarly, she also mentions about a story of a lepcha temple around Tiger Hill where a white swan resided. In the lepcha belief system, the British attempts to destroy the temple and shoot the sacred swan, which led to a curse on the white soldiers. Next day, all the white officers were found dead. So this is a kind of a resentment which is coming out in the stories about the fact that the lepchas do not like the British intrusion into their place, their space. We also come across instances of resistance. The Bhils, they took to banditry and they would attack the British moving up to Mount Abu. And the British would constantly be asking about the Sirohi Darbar to stop them from attacking the British officers and the army officers who were moving to Abu. Todas also showed their resentment. They refused to allow any British to enter into their sacred space, which was an entire ceremony around the milking of the cattle. So they would not allow them to come into that particular space. So there is this kind of resistance. And now, why this resentment and resistance is coming? One is, of course, they were not taken into consideration when the British moved into these places. But there are other reasons, the legal reasons, the laws and regulations which came up. So there are colonial laws which are introduced in the course of the 19th century, which actually restricts the movement of the indigenous people. Where they were the lords of the jungle, of the land, suddenly they are reduced to being on the margins. Their movements were restricted. They were pushed to the periphery. So the symbiotic relationship which existed between the human being and the environment actually was disrupted. For instance, the Todas of Nilgiri were considered to be the territorial sovereigns of Nilgiris. They were paid a tribute, one-sixth of the produce, by the other hill people. The British discontinued the traditional practice. Under the colonial laws, the rights of the Todas were constrained. Under the forest laws, the Todas could no longer freely graze their buffaloes or collect fuel and grass. They had to take permits to remove timber and bamboo, which they needed to build their houses, their huts, and their settlements. So certainly there is a resentment that why this has been denied to them. This is their place, and this is being denied to them. So these are the colonial laws which are actually hampering them. And we know the Beals also, the Beals who resisted throughout, they were finally put in the category of the criminal tribes under the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. And there's not one, there are so many of the tribes which were put into it, where the entire community was categorized as criminals. There is a collective categorization. This is the worst kind of dehumanization which could occur to a particular uh, community or a group, social group. So this is a kind of vulnerability to which they were exposed at that time. Now, very quickly, I'll just briefly touch upon, because I can see I'm overshooting the time also. The post colonial state, Indian context, many of you being from the law background would be far more familiar, but I feel that these are areas or the directions in which we also need to now look at and try to bring in the interdisciplinarity in our researches, where we look and maybe provide a better understanding of our present laws also, how best we can make our laws and regulations more effective. That we know that a modern colonial state has been replaced by a nation state. There is a suffering of the various communities and ethnicities under invasion and colonization. According to one report, a cultural survivor report prepared in University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2016, 84.3 million or 8.2 indigenous people or Adivasis stay in India. In the Indian Constitution, we have certain provisions for them. Article 15, Clause 4, Article 46, which provides some protection for them. Then the fifth and the sixth schedules of the Indian Constitution also has for protection for tribal populations. And then, of course, the fundamental rights and directive principles also do have fundamental rights, of course, will come also under Article 15, and directive principles also talk about it. The Local Committee Report 1965, interestingly, this defined indigenous people to be characterized by primitive traits, distinctive culture, geographical isolation, shyness of contact with community at large, and backwardness. Now, this is something which is a bit discriminatory, because the moment you use the term like primitive traits, what are primitive traits? You're already showing a bias. What are backward? Is their way of life backward just because they have a different way of life from what the modern social norms and structures are? This is something which legal uh, laws, the legal rules, etc., need to look into. That are we being paternalistic towards them? Are we again patronizing them? Or is there a space for diversity in the modern nation state, to provide them that dignity, to provide them for the diverse cultural spaces in the modern nation state? That is what is important to keep in mind. Just because they're distinctive, just because they have a culture which is different from the mainstream culture, does not mean that they have to be homogenized. That diversity should be respected. That is very important to keep in mind. So we also have various international conventions. The first one to come on it was ILO Convention 107, especially with regard to indigenous and tribal people. It was partially revised in 1989, recognizing the aspirations of these people to exercise control over their own institutions, way of life, and economic development. And the most important is the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous People in 2007 with 46 articles. India is a signatory to it. It voted in favor of it. So we have to provide for the concerns of the indigenous people. And some of these concerns, they are many. I'm just highlighting a few. Recognition of traditional lands and collective sharing, associations of these lands with the past associations to be respected, especially their relation with the ancestors. Right to celebrate their way of life and culture, access to health, education, and a life of dignity, honor the settlements which were made with the indigenous people. We have to look at those aspects. Then the challenges historically, there has been a continuity, tradition, and continued existence in one place much before colonization and conquest. So that has to be considered. They cannot be displaced because they have a strong emotional connection with the place, and that has to be respected. Empower the indigenous people, protect their land rights and usages, recognize the cultural diversity and social and ecological harmony of these people, of humankind, which is also part of 1989 convention. So these are some of the points that I wanted to take up in that brief overview. I'll be happy to take up more in discussion, but I would like to mention, which I somewhere mentioned in the middle, that how sholas of Uti, which was a real ecological phenomenon, have been destroyed. When the British came and started developing the hill station of Utakaman, they brought in eucalyptus and weeds, which were, you know, that weeds are very parasitic, and eucalyptus also takes a lot of water. And due to this, the entire water reservoir of Uti was drying up, and that led to the destruction of sholas also, because these are of exotic variety which were from some other place and they were brought in to Uti. So this is the problem with ecological imbalance, the sustainable development issue. So we need to have a participative community nature interaction, which was done in the case of some of the forest sanctuaries in India. That community also needs to be part of any kind of development with regard to coming up of the sanctuaries, natural sanctuaries, wildlife sanctuaries. They cannot be excluded from it. They have to be part of it. So this is one of the ways the state is negotiating, but there is a lot more to be done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, for interesting talk. Very informative, ma'am. Ma'am, if you allow our attendees have some questions.
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Ma'am, first question is, how did indigenous people respond to colonial rule?
They are, as I mentioned to you, also with the case of these hills, but also there have been uprisings, the coal uprising, the Munda uprising, the Sidhu Kanu was the coal uprising, and which, of course, they're talking about how they are being exploited by the money lenders, which is also coming with the process of colonization. So indigenous population is responding differently. Some, in the case of Todas, they withdraw, they retreat, they decide not to have anything to do with the English, the Europeans or the colonizers. In the case of Beals, they start attacking like a guerrilla tactic, hit and run. In the case of Lepchas, they are not able to articulate to the British because British are formidable. They are far superior in terms of their war machinery, their technology. So they actually articulate it in their stories when they talk about how the British were cursed. So this is how they articulate. So what is interesting to remember, there are different modes of resistance. There is no singular mode of resistance that only by a war or a battle you resist, but you can resist in so many ways. A historian's job is to find about what are these different modes of resistance.
Ma'am, there is a question. Modern Indian state is also towing same line.
Yes, to a large extent, they need to now come out of that. Is, I always say at times, we need to dismantle the colonial past. We need to decolonize. So some of the practices of the colonial state are some things which we are seeing a certain continuity. Of course, they did try to bring in participative community rights of the indigenous people with regard to forest laws and regulations, but a lot more needs to be done. We need to dismantle the colonial process. It's a legacy
Ma'am,
which we are still in the process of unraveling.
ma'am, one more question. Is there
Yeah.
any difference between human rights and environmental human rights?
I can't honestly say because see, this is an important question you have asked because this is something I would like to draw attention because when we are talking about the rights of the indigenous people, We are not talking human rights, talk about individual rights, whereas indigenous people rights are community rights, collective rights. And this is where, that is why the 2000 convention becomes important, because we need to also look at the collective rights of the indigenous people, that how they have been eroded. So when we are looking at environment and human rights, then somewhere there has to be a synchronization with the community interests also. So I would say it's a kind of a modification, because human rights have been highly individualistic rights. But in many countries we have a lot of rights which also have to take into account other aspects. So with regard to indigenous people in particular, they are more vulnerable because they are losing out on their livelihoods, their way of life. So somewhere a kind of a sustainable, uh, that is why I think sustainable development becomes very important for them in the millennium.
Ma'am, one more question. What are the main challenges of setting sustainable development goals in reference to indigenous people?
Some of them I have already highlighted, the main goals, because they have had, they, as I said, they have faced the worst kind of displacements in the past and destruction. How can we ensure conservation and preservation of their habitat, their land, and also provide for empowering these indigenous people, which is something which they have continuously been fighting with at international forum as well as at the national level. I went for my field research to a field visit to Uti, and there I had interactions with the Toda community, and those people wanted to know how can this, their concerns they feel are still not addressed. They shared with me an interesting story where they said that, we were this piece of land we never gave to the British. They just simply took it by giving us some sheep and something. So they did not realize that this is a transaction which is taking place. For them, it is their land. They only allowed British to settle and flourish, but it does not mean that they have given away forever their land. So even till now, they have been fighting with the Indian state with regard to their traditional rights, their lands, which had been taken by the colonial state and which had been taken by the post-colonial Indian state. So they are actually putting representation that these are Toda lands. You have to recognize these lands and preserve those lands. So these are negotiations which are, of course, a very complicated negotiation. There are challenges for us, and among the tribes also there is a sense of hierarchy, stratification, domination of one and the other, which also leads to intertribal conflicts also. But that also has to be negotiated. Then like for instance in the case of lepchas, there is a genuine apprehension that they're losing out their language, their scriptures, their tradition to the other dominant communities which have come up in the with the coming of colonization. So they're still negotiating. They are negotiating with the and you know it that today Darjeeling is known for the Gurkha presence, but their Darjeeling is also land of lepchas. So these are complex issues which will be have to be negotiated with the modern nation state as well as at international platforms.
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you for your thought-provoking words and
Yeah.
providing such a detailed information about indigenous people and their rights and about colonial era. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.